I'm on a beach in Mexico, in Cancun. Been in Mexico for 2 months, over 2 months. We arrived in Cancun yesterday. We've been staying in more off the beaten path places. But my friend is returning to New York and he wanted some comfort and niceness. And indeed, the beach is much nicer here than any of the other ones we've been to. Anyway, I wanted to tell a story about the moon and plants and something I learned while being here. I think actually the only organized tour we went on, there was a Mayan man who was guiding us around an old chicle farm where they used to harvest the sap, like a natural latex, to make gum, where Wrigley's first started making their gum from. And he was telling us the story about how the trees, if you cut them at the right time, when the moon was in the right position, the trees would last forever. And he said something about, the Mayans knew the best time to cut the trees. They always knew when the moon was in the right place. And I thought, does the moon really affect the flow of sap in trees? And then I thought about it, and I remember biology and anatomy and studies in high school. The general pumping of the xylem and phloem in the trees, but was it facilitated diffusion or was it some kind of gravitational pull from heavenly bodies? I didn't remember what actually caused the xylem and phloem to flow. And I thought of all the trees people harvest sap out of, different rubber trees, latex trees, and of course maple trees, and I don't know how many others. And so I started to do some research online. And there were lots of forums from maple tappers that talked about the effect of the moon on the trees in very non-scientific, old folksy kind of ways. Like, there were a lot of people who would say, I don't think it has anything to do with the moon, or, yes, my grandparents would always say it has something to do with the moon. A lot of people had adages about the wind, like wind from the east, the sap is best. Wind from the west, the sap is best. Wind from the east, the sap is less, something like that. And then somebody else commented, my grandfather had that same thing about the wind, but it was talking about fishing, so it was very like that kind of old folksy kind of, not to say that this stuff is wrong, but it's certainly not scientific, and it's certainly, it doesn't talk about evidence. It just talks about old folk wisdom, right? So then I read some other scientific articles that were done in Europe that talked about studying the flow of water in plants, and it was talking about small plants more than trees, and they were using incredibly fine measurements up to the micrometers, I think it were, or nanometers, I don't remember now, that they were able to show that when the moon's gravitational force wasn't at its strongest, for those of you who don't know about tides, the moon's gravitational force is at its strongest on the full moon and the new moon. The new moon is slightly stronger, but the reason that the gravitational force of the moon is at its strongest then is it is in line with the sun. So this is something that we all take for granted because we all just live here on this planet, but the sun is constantly pulling gravitationally on the Earth. That's why the Earth is in orbit to the sun, because there's a gravitational pull from the sun. The moon is always in gravitational force with the Earth. That's why it's in orbit. The movement of the moon around the Earth is what causes waves and tides. And when the moon and the sun line up together, the waves and the tides are bigger. I knew this. I didn't grow up around the ocean. I grew up in the middle of the United States, so I didn't know anything about tides growing up, but I went to the Bay of Fundy between Nova Scotia and Maine one year, where apparently it has some of the world's highest tides. I think it was like a 60-foot tide differential on a new moon. And so I learned about causes of the tides and tide differentials and stuff then. I guess I have to walk because someone's turning music on. That won't do. So even though I had learned this about tides, it had never occurred to me to think that the moon was pulling on plants. I had thought that maybe the moon was pulling on people, that, you know, there's this whole thing about the full moon makes people crazy, right? I was like, well, you know, I hadn't given it a lot of thought, but one of the women that I mentioned this to, she said, yeah, I wrote, I don't know if it was her thesis or just some paper. She wrote some very in-depth paper on how the full moon affects the chemicals in the body, and something about how it pulls all the water up into the brain more at the height of a full moon. When the moon's directly above you, it's pulling all the water, and it just causes all the chemicals to flow more or function differently. The brain is flooded or something. I don't know. She said that there was, I don't know if her paper was scientific or conjecture, but she said, yeah, I had studied that. So if there was some evidence that showed that when the moon wasn't pulling the fluids up properly, that the plants would swell. So between the full and the new moon, the diameter of the stems would get ever so slightly larger, because there wasn't as much gravitational action pulling the water up the stalks. So I really wanted to make this video to give you, to invite you, to ask you to imagine the moon moving around the planet. And it moves pretty slowly, you know, it moves pretty slowly. The Earth is turning, the moon is moving at a different rate than the Earth is turning. And as it moves, it's pulling, like a bow, all of the oceans up ever so slightly. And when it's in line with the sun, either opposing or conjunct, it pulls it a little stronger, right? One of the weird hallucinations I've had in recent years, and I don't think this is drug related, it's just been, you know, sometimes my mind does weird things, maybe because of the moon. And I have thought of all of the plants, the trees on the planet being like, here, I'm gonna turn around so you can see the palm trees while I talk about this, and all these fucking crazy hotels. That the trees are like tentacles coming out of the earth. They waver really slowly, right, with the wind and with their growth. If you've ever seen time-lapse videos of plants, you see that they do this as they're growing. So they're like big alien tentacles that are rooted into the planet, and they're interacting with the sky and the waters and the dirt, and they're creating themselves, you know, out of the planet and wavering. So imagine, if you will, that the moon is moving around the planet, pulling the oceans, and simultaneously all of the subtle water, the water that's in the grasses, the water that's in the weeds, the water that's in the trees, and the water that's in all the animals, there's a wave following the moon as it goes around the planet. I don't know what the time, you may have heard, there's a certain amount of time it takes for the moon, or for the light from the sun to get to us. I think it's 8 seconds or 8 minutes. I think it's 8 minutes. It takes the light to get from the sun to the earth. Maybe the moon is 8 seconds. Something like that. So it might be longer for the effect of the moon. I know the biggest tides and waves are in the days following the new moon and full moon, not actually on the days. They're slightly bigger after the full moon and new moon than on the days of the moon because of the echo effect or the rebound effect. But if you imagine the moon is moving around the planet and just pulling the water in all of us, in all the plants, there's this wave of the water going up, following the moon, and then falling back down into the gravity of the earth, and then being pulled up with the moon and the sun, and then washing back down into the surface of the earth. If we're all like tubes, we're fleshy sacks filled with water, and all the plants are these tubes, very branchy tubes filled with water, and we're all getting sucked up and falling back down, rising and falling. It's one of those things that's true that I had never thought of. Maybe you've never thought of. And maybe if you can imagine that that's something that we've lived on this crazy, strange alien planet our whole lives, and probably a lot longer. And you've just been taking it for granted forever. And if you haven't taken it for granted, tell me about when you learned about it, or if you always knew it, or if it was something that was just intuitive that you always knew about. And take some time to give some love to the water and the moon. Hello, water, moon. Hello, moon. Hello, water. Can you see the moon now? Yeah, there's the moon. There's the moon. Right on top of my head. Hi, moon. It's getting full, so hopefully I'll be able to post this tonight, and then maybe you'll see it, and then maybe you'll think about it on the day of the full moon, and you'll stand there and you'll see, can I feel the moon pulling up? One of the reasons I wanted to make this video is I was floating in this water for an hour or something, and I saw the moon above me, and I was like, can I feel the moon pulling my heart up? Can I feel the moon pulling? Is it easier to float because the moon is directly above me right now? Being a human sure is fun. All right. Love you. Good night.